Tectacune Jaxon Williams watched, dumbstruck, as his nonverbal, blind 5-year-old son, Oliver, reached out for a lump of mud and then whispered a name. Layla, his tiny voice said. A poor black girl from the neighborhood had done. The unthinkable unlocked his world. Could one simple act of shared play rewrite what doctors said was impossible? But to understand how such a miracle unfolded, we must go back to where it all began, to a night filled with celebration. Champagne and the unshakable belief that money could solve anything. Jaxon Williams had built his empire from nothing. From a rented apartment cluttered with secondhand computers, he'd created one of the world's most powerful tech conglomerates. He had everything most people only dreamed of. The cars, the mansion, the private jets, the endless headlines that called him the man who could predict the future. But when his wife Emma gave birth to their first and only child, Oliver, he realized there were some things even the future couldn't control. Oliver was born under bright white hospital lights. Tiny and quiet, too quiet, Emma had expected. That first sharp cry that filled a mother's heart with relief, but instead there was only silence. Nurses glanced at one another. A doctor leaned in. Machines hummed. Then, finally, a faint sound escaped the newborn's lips. Not a cry, not even a whimper, but something soft, uncertain, almost fragile. Emma clutched Jackson's hand. "Why isn't he crying?" she asked, her voice trembling. "He's breathing," the nurse reassured, forcing a smile. "Just give him a moment," but that moment turned into hours. Then days, Oliver didn't cry. He didn't focus on faces. His tiny hands never reached out for his parents' touch. He stared past everything, eyes open but unfocused, as though looking through the world rather than at it. At first, doctors called it delayed development. They told the Williamses to wait. Babies develop at their own pace. But Jaxon was not a man who waited. He flew in neurologists from Europe, geneticists from Japan, vision experts from the best institutions money could buy. The results were all the same. One late afternoon, middle-aged neurologist with kind but weary eyes sat them down in a quiet consultation room. "I'm sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Williams," he began. "Your son's visual cortex never developed properly. It's completely blind. And based on his scans, there's significant underactivity in the language and sensory areas of the brain. He may never be able to speak or even recognize the world around him." Emma broke down. Jaxon just sat there, perfectly still, his mind racing through every possibility, every solution. In his world, problems were puzzles. Puzzles could always be solved. But this was something he couldn't buy, program, or fix. He built Oliver a world of light, sound, and science. The nursery looked more like a research lab than a baby's room. Specialized music therapy machines, sensory, touch. Walls, robotic toys that responded to sound, anything that might awaken a spark inside his son. For years, therapists came and went. Some spoke softly of hope, others hid behind medical jargon. None could reach Oliver. At 3 years old, Oliver had never spoken a word, never smiled voluntarily, never reached for anything or anyone. His mother tried to hide her tears. His father buried himself in work. The mansion became a quiet place, large, cold, echoing with unspoken grief. Then, outside the tall black gates of the Williams estate, life went on, messy, loud, colorful. And among the kids who played on the cracked sidewalks was a little black girl named Layla Johnson. At 8 years old, Layla had seen more hardship than most adults. Her father had passed when she was a toddler. Her mother worked double shifts, cleaning offices downtown. Layla wore hand-me-downs and made her own toys from mud and sticks. But she had imagination, the kind that could turn dirt into castles and puddles into oceans every afternoon. She'd sit near the outer fence of the Williams property, shaping mud sculptures while humming softly to herself. She didn't know who lived there. She only knew the lawn beyond was perfect, too perfect. Sometimes she saw glimpses of a boy in a wheelchair pushed by a nurse. The boy never looked around, never waved, never smiled. Layla thought he looked like a doll, pretty but empty. One bright spring day as she sat sculpting a small turtle from a bowl of wet soil. The nurse brought the boy closer to the gate than usual. Layla tilted her head, curious. She noticed his fingers twitching slightly, as though trying to feel the air. Something about him drew her in, not pity, but wonder. She stood up, wiped her hands on her shorts, and whispered to herself, he just needs to touch something real. That moment, ordinary, fleeting, would become the spark that changed both of their worlds forever. Inside the house, Jaxon Williams stood by the window, watching as his son sat motionless under the sun. For years, he'd fought against impossible odds, believing technology could rebuild what nature had denied. But now, staring at that lifeless stillness, he felt the one thing he'd never known before: helplessness, and just beyond the glass. Unseen by him, a poor black girl with dirt-streaked fingers pressed a tiny mud sculpture against the fence. Whispering, "You can feel this, can't you?" The doctors called it a condition. Jaxon Williams called it a challenge. But for Emma, it was simply a heartbreak. Years passed inside the mansion that the world called a dream and the family inside knew as a quiet cage. Oliver grew, but his world remained the same, a blank, echoing space without color, shape, or words. Each morning began with a schedule more precise than a corporate calendar. Speech therapy, sensory therapy, light stimulation, auditory response drills. The Williams home hummed with machines designed to teach a little boy how to feel alive. Jaxon threw himself into it as if he were engineering a new product. If money could open the human brain, he would find a way. He had specialists flown in from every corner of the globe, men and women whose fees rivaled the cost of small companies. They brought experimental devices, vibrating gloves, haptic sensors, machines that pulsed with artificial warmth. Some days it seemed to work. Oliver's fingers twitched when sound patterns played. Other days, nothing. The boy sat motionless, his clouded eyes wide open but fixed on nothing. Emma used to hold him close and whisper stories. Once there was a little boy who couldn't see the sun. She'd begin, her voice trembling. But he could feel it every morning right here. She'd place his small palm over his chest, hoping somehow the warmth of her love could seep through. But Oliver never reacted, not even a smile. One morning, after yet another failed session, Emma broke. She slammed the kitchen counter with her fist and cried, "He's not a robot, Jaxon. You can't program love into him." Jaxon didn't respond. He stood at the window, jaw clenched, staring at his reflection in the glass. In that reflection, he saw a man who had conquered every market except the one that mattered most. That night, long after Emma had gone upstairs, he walked into Oliver's room. The boy was awake, lying in his crib, eyes open as always. Jaxon sat beside him and whispered, "You know, buddy, your dad builds things. He fixes things. But I don't know how to fix you." His voice cracked, something it hadn't done in years. "Just give me one sign you can hear me, please." One sign. Silence. Only the faint whir of the air purifier filled the room. Jaxon reached out and placed a small mechanical cube in Oliver's hand, a prototype he'd designed himself. It emitted soft sounds, vibrations, and music. For a brief second, Oliver's fingers closed around it. Hope flared like lightning, and then died. The boy dropped the cube, his expression empty. Outside those walls, the world was very different. The same sunlight that filtered gently through the Williams glass windows beat harshly down on cracked pavement, where Layla Johnson and her friends played barefoot. Layla lived 3 blocks away in a peeling apartment that smelled of detergent. And Rain, her mother Patrice, was rarely home before midnight. She'd leave meals prepped on the counter, rice, beans, sometimes just bread and butter, and a note that always said the same thing: "Be good, baby. Don't let the world make you small." Layla spent her afternoons outside because the apartment felt lonely. Her favorite pastime was making things out of mud, animals, flowers, even people. The neighbors often laughed. "Grr, why you always playing in dirt?" They'd say Layla would shrug. "'Cause dirt listens." She'd answer with a grin. It don't care if you're rich or poor. She'd never been inside the massive white mansion that loomed at the end of her street, surrounded by manicured lawns and trimmed hedges. It looked like something from another world. Yet every few days, she'd spot that pale little boy sitting on the grass with a nurse or therapist nearby, motionless like a statue. Something about him tugged at her heart, not because he looked different, but because he looked alone. Layla started bringing her creations closer to the fence whenever she saw him. A turtle, a small truck, once even a bird with spread wings. She'd set them near the gate and whisper, "These are for you." She didn't know if he could see them, but something told her to keep trying. One afternoon, she noticed the boy's hand twitching again, slow, uncertain, like he wanted to reach toward her. The nurse quickly adjusted his chair and pulled him back. "Not today, Oliver," the woman said softly. Layla frowned. "Oliver," she whispered, testing the name. "Hey, Oliver, you want to touch the turtle?" No response, but she swore she saw his fingers move. She grinned. "That's okay, I'll wait." Inside, Jackson's frustration grew heavier by the day. His empire was thriving. New partnerships, new patents, new interviews where he smiled for cameras and lied through his teeth about how family keeps me grounded. But each time he returned home, reality hit him like a punch to the gut. He'd look at his son, this silent boy with a face that mirrored his own, and feel powerless. One evening, he overheard the gardener chatting with a maid about that little girl outside the fence. "She keeps leaving mud toys out there," the gardener chuckled. "Says they're for the boy." Something in Jaxon twitched. Irritation, maybe guilt. He didn't like strangers near his property, especially children from the neighborhood. "Tell her to stay away," he ordered sharply. But later that night, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would a child care so much about someone she didn't know? Emma, overhearing him mutter, said quietly, "Because she's a child. They see hope where we don't." The next day, Jaxon allowed Oliver's nurse to take him out again, near the same patch of grass where the mud toys always appeared. The boy sat quietly, his hands in his lap. Layla crouched on the other side of the fence, shaping a tiny turtle. She looked up, met the nurse's wary eyes, then focused on Oliver. "Hey, you remember me?" she said brightly. "I made the truck yesterday. You liked that, huh?" The nurse said nothing, but she didn't move him away either. Layla pressed the turtle against the bottom of the fence so that its wet shell oozed through. "Here," she said gently. "It's bumpy. That's his shell. And here's his head, smooth." To everyone's surprise, Oliver's fingers lifted, hesitant, trembling, and brushed the mud seeping through the metal bars. His head tilted slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. The nurse gasped. Layla's eyes widened. "Yeah," she whispered, smiling. "That's the shell. You feel it, don't you?" Oliver's hands stayed there. Then, ever so slowly, he smiled. It wasn't big, just a twitch of lips, uncertain, new. But it was. Enough to send a jolt through everyone watching. From the mansion's doorway, Jaxon stood frozen. He'd come out to call them in for lunch, but his voice caught in his throat. His son, his unreachable, silent son, was responding. Not to technology, not to therapy, but to a child's muddy fingers and a turtle made of dirt. For the first time in 5 years, hope didn't feel like science. It felt like faith. For days after that afternoon, Jaxon couldn't stop replaying what he'd seen. His son's tiny fingers brushing against mud, his lips curling into something close to a smile. The image haunted him in the best way possible. It'd seen scientists demonstrate neural reactivity on multi-million-dollar machines. But nothing had stirred Oliver like that simple touch through the fence. Jaxon didn't know whether to feel grateful or ashamed. Grateful that someone had finally reached his boy. Ashamed that it wasn't him by the next week. The mud toys started appearing more often. A turtle one day, a truck the next, a tiny dog with floppy ears. Each morning, the staff would find them near the gate, still damp from the night air. Sometimes Oliver's nurse would bring one inside, letting him explore it during therapy. The boy's hands, once limp and lifeless, began to move with purpose. He'd trace the uneven surfaces, pressing his palms against every ridge and groove. The therapists called it unusual sensory engagement. Jaxon called it a miracle in progress. Still, he couldn't ignore where the miracles were coming from. The girl outside Layla one breezy Saturday morning. Curiosity finally overcame pride. Jaxon stepped out onto the porch just as Layla was setting another mud creation by the fence. She froze, startled by the tall man in a gray suit watching her from the doorway. "Morning," he said curtly. His voice carried the kind of authority that made most adults straighten up, but Layla didn't flinch. "Hi," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "You're Oliver's dad." The billionaire blinked. He hadn't expected her to know his name, much less speak so confidently. "I am, and you are, Layla," she said. "I live down the street." He nodded stiffly. "You've been leaving things here." She smiled. "They're not things. They're friends." For Oliver, Jaxon had no idea how to respond. "Friends?" he repeated under his breath. Then, after a moment, he sighed. "He seems to like them." "I know," Layla said simply. "He listens with his hands. I can tell." Jaxon stared at her, a child covered in dried mud, wearing mismatched sandals, speaking with the calm certainty of a scientist who had just cracked a code. Something inside him softened. "Would you?" He hesitated, surprising himself. "Would you like to meet him properly?" Layla's eyes lit up. "For real?" He nodded once. "For real." The next afternoon, the nurse guided Oliver to a shaded patch of grass near the porch. Layla stood nearby, clutching her usual bowl of mud. She looked nervous for the first time. The mansion felt enormous up close, the kind of place that swallowed sound. But the moment she saw Oliver, all the fear melted away. "Hey, it's me," she said gently. "Layla." Oliver tilted his head at the sound of her voice. His lips parted slightly. The nurse glanced at Jaxon, who stood just behind them, watching every detail. Layla knelt in front of Oliver and placed the bowl between them. "Today," she said, "we're making trucks. You ever felt a truck before?" Oliver didn't respond, but his fingers twitched. "Here." She guided his hand into the cool, squishy mud. "That's the wheel. Bumpy. And this," she rolled the clay like dirt into a block shape. "That's the body. Smooth." Oliver's fingers moved across the shapes, slow but deliberate. He squeezed the mud, pressing his thumb into it, and a small sound escaped his throat. Not quite a word, but something close to laughter. Layla grinned. "You like that, huh?" Jaxon felt something break inside him. For 5 years he'd tried to engineer this exact moment. And now it was happening not because of therapy, but because of a little girl in a bowl of dirt. They played for nearly an hour. Layla's chatter filled the air. "Now we gotta make 2 trucks so they can race. You make yours big, okay? I'll make mine small." Oliver reached for another lump of mud and copied her movements. His coordination was clumsy, but his effort was new, alive. When Layla laughed, he did too, a short, awkward giggle that made Emma, watching from the balcony, burst into tears. When the nurse finally said it was time to stop, Oliver reached toward Layla instead of retreating. His hand brushed her arm, smearing mud on her sleeve. She laughed and smeared some back onto his cheek. "There," she said proudly. "Now you look like me." Oliver's lips moved. The sound was faint, broken. But real Lay froze. "What?" He said it again, clearer this time, though still shaky. "Layla," the world stopped. The nurse gasped. Jaxon's eyes filled with tears before he even realized it. For years he had begged God for a sign, a word, a gesture, anything. And here it was, his son, saying a name. Emma ran out from the balcony, kneeling beside them, hands over her mouth. He said her name, she whispered. He said her name. Layla just smiled through her own tears. Told you, he listens. That evening, Jaxon sat in Oliver's room long after his son had fallen asleep. He stared at the small mud truck, drying on the windowsill, uneven, imperfect, a bit cracked at the edges. The most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He thought about the little girl with the wild hair and the fearless eyes, about how she'd done in minutes what millions of dollars hadn't done in years. He whispered to himself, a poor child did what science couldn't. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel powerful. He felt humbled. Outside, under the glow of the streetlight, Layla skipped home barefoot, mud still clinging to her fingers. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, whether she'd be allowed back, whether the grown-ups would change their minds, but she didn't care. She'd found a friend, and somewhere inside that giant house on the hill, that friend was. Sleeping soundly, his first word echoing softly in the air. Layla. The next morning, sunlight poured into the Williams mansion like a quiet blessing. For the first time in years, it didn't feel cold inside those white walls. The air felt different, lighter, warmer, as if Oliver's single word had unlocked something far bigger than language. Jaxon barely slept. He had replayed the moment over and over, the sound of Oliver's voice, the way Layla had smiled without realizing the magnitude of what had just happened. That one small name had shattered 5 years of silence and every limit doctors had predicted. When the family's neurologist arrived later that morning, Jaxon could hardly wait to tell him. He spoke, he said, almost trembling. Said a name, Layla, clear as day. The doctor adjusted his glasses skeptically. Mr. Williams, children with Oliver's condition can occasionally mimic sounds, not necessarily language recognition. Jackson's voice hardened. Then, explain why he said the same name that belongs to the girl who reached him, the same one he smiles for. The doctor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. If that's true, it would be extraordinary. Extraordinary, Jaxon repeated softly, staring out the window. That's one word for it. Meanwhile, outside those manicured gates, Layla's world carried on, as usual, dusty sneakers, laughter, and the smell of summer rain. But now each day had something new. Oliver. She woke up thinking about him, wondering what they'd build next, what shapes he might like to touch. Her mother noticed the change. You've been spending a lot of time up by that rich folks? House Patrice said one evening as they ate dinner. Layla grinned. 'Cause my friend lives there. Patrice raised an eyebrow. Friend? Yeah, Oliver. He can't see, but he laughs now. I make him toys. Her mother froze with her fork midair. You mean the Williams boy? Honey, those people got more money than God. They ain't gonna keep you around forever. Layla shrugged. Maybe not, but he needs me. Patrice looked at her daughter's determined little face and sighed. You sound like your daddy. That night, as Patrice cleaned offices across town, Layla sat by the window, molding fresh mud figures under the glow of a streetlight, preparing for tomorrow. Over the next few weeks, sessions between Layla and Oliver became part of the mansion's routine. Every afternoon at 3, she'd arrive at the front gate with her bowl of mud. The guards had been told to let her in. It was Jackson's personal order. The staff whispered about it, the billionaire's son and the poor black girl who somehow woke him up. Layla didn't care about whispers. She cared about Oliver's giggle when she made animal sounds or the way his fingers wiggled with curiosity as they built together. She would describe each thing she made. This is a frog smooth here, bumpy there, and he would mimic the textures on his own. It wasn't long before therapists began studying the sessions. Cameras were installed discreetly in the garden. Specialists came with notebooks, trying to decode what was happening. They saw something no textbook had ever described. Communication born not from therapy, but from trust. One afternoon, Oliver reached out, touched Layla's cheek, and whispered, smile. She froze. You know that word? He nodded, small lips curling upward. Layla smiles. The staff standing nearby went silent. One nurse quietly wiped away a tear. Emma, watching from the patio, whispered to her husband, "He doesn't just hear her. He feels her." Jaxon put his arm around her shoulders. "She's teaching him more about connection than all the experts combined." Soon, word began to spread beyond the mansion. The media caught wind of it first. A billionaire is blind. Nonverbal son suddenly speaking for the first time thanks to a little girl from a poor neighborhood. Reporters camped outside the gates, desperate for photos. Jaxon kept them at bay for as long as he could, wanting to protect both children. But one image slipped through. A photo of Layla holding Oliver's hands. Both of them covered in mud, smiling at each other. That image went viral overnight. People called it the mud miracle. News anchors debated whether it was science, faith, or something in between. Some praised Jaxon for his openness. Others accused him of exploiting a poor child's kindness. Jaxon ignored the noise. He knew what was real, the sound of his son's laughter filling their once silent home. But fame brought new challenges. Paparazzi lingered near the neighborhood. Layla's mother received letters, some kind, others cruel. "They'll use her," one warned. "Rich people always do." Patrice confronted Jaxon one morning, standing firmly on the marble floor of his grand foyer. "I appreciate what your family's done for Layla," she said, voice trembling but steady. "But she's just a child. She ain't your experiment." Jaxon nodded solemnly. "You're right, she's not. She's Oliver's miracle and yours too, if you'll let her keep being who she is." Patrice studied him for a long moment, then said softly, "Then promise me one thing. Don't take her light from her." He nodded. "Never." Inside the mansion, Layla's influence continued to grow. She taught Oliver songs, simple rhymes, about animals and colors he couldn't see but could imagine. She told him stories of her neighborhood, of rain puddles, and tree swings and laughter that didn't need permission. In return, Oliver began to speak in fragments. Mud, soft. Truck, big. Layla, happy. Each word was a gift. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Jaxon watched from a distance as Layla and Oliver played with toy trucks on the grass. The same scene he'd once thought impossible now played out daily. Two children, one blind, one barefoot, building a world of their own. He whispered to Emma, "Do you see it?" She smiled through tears. "I do. He's not trapped anymore." "And neither are we," Jaxon said quietly. That night, as he tucked Oliver into bed, the boy reached out and said, "Daddy." Jaxon froze. "Say it again," he whispered. "Daddy." Oliver repeated softly, smiling. Layla said, "You love me." Jackson's throat tightened. "She's right, son. I do more than you'll ever know." He turned off the light and stood by the door, watching his son fall asleep, mud still faintly under his fingernails. Proof of a friendship that had rewritten fate. And somewhere across town, Layla lay in her small bed, dreaming of trucks and laughter, unaware that her simple kindness had changed a billionaire's world and the world's definition of a miracle. Months passed and the seasons changed, but one thing remained constant: the sound of laughter from the Williams estate. Where once there had been sterile silence, now the air was alive with joy, curiosity, and the magic of two unlikely friends who refused to be bound by what the world said was possible. Oliver's progress astonished everyone. The boy who once lived in shadows now spoke short sentences, sang with Layla, and even started recognizing people by their voices and scents. He no longer feared touch. He embraced it. Every pat of mud, every brush of grass under his fingertips, was a connection to a world he could finally feel. Layla, now known in the neighborhood as the Little Healer, became a symbol of something bigger than herself. People would smile when they saw her walking up the long driveway, barefoot, and holding her bowl of mud like it was treasure. To her, it was. That mud wasn't dirt. It was life, creation, communication. It was her way of saying, "I see you," even to someone who couldn't see her back. One afternoon, Jaxon called her and her mother into his office. The room, usually filled with business charts and monitors, now had children's drawings taped across the walls. Oliver's first attempts at art. They were abstract smears of color guided by Layla's hands. Jaxon smiled warmly. "Layla, I want to thank you, not just for what you've done for Oliver, but for reminding me what matters." Layla fidgeted shyly. "I didn't do nothing big, sir. I just played." He leaned forward. "That's exactly it. You did what no therapy, no technology, no fortune could do. You gave him love without limits." He turned to Patrice, emotions softening his usual firmness. "I'd like to sponsor Layla's education, fully, whatever she dreams to study. Wherever she wants to go." Patrice's eyes filled with tears. "Mr. Williams, that's too much." "No," he said quietly, shaking his head. "It's not nearly enough." Layla's face lit up. "Can I learn to be a teacher? Like one who helps kids like Oliver?" Jaxon smiled. "You already are one." By winter, their story had reached. Beyond their small town, news outlets around the world covered it, not as a tale of wealth or pity, but as proof of the power of human connection. A billionaire's son and a poor girl from the streets, united not by science, but by soul. They were invited to speak at a children's hospital fundraiser. Layla stood on stage beside Jaxon and Emma, her hair neatly tied, her hands still. A little muddy from that morning's play. Cameras flashed, but she wasn't nervous. She simply turned to the audience and said, "Oliver taught me that people don't need eyes to see. They just need someone who believes in them." The room erupted in applause. Some cried openly. Others simply nodded, as if those simple words had reminded them of something they'd forgotten long ago. Back home, Oliver and Layla continued their daily rituals. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Oliver sat cross-legged on the grass, holding a small sculpture Layla had helped him shape. "It's you," she said softly, standing tall. He ran his fingers over the uneven edges. "Layla's strong," he said, smiling. She grinned back, "and Oliver brave." The two children sat in silence, listening to the wind. For them, the world wasn't divided by wealth or color, sight or blindness. It was one big playground of sound, touch, and feeling. Every laugh, every creation, every whisper was a reminder that miracles don't always come from heaven. Sometimes they rise from the ground, from a bowl of mud and a heart full of kindness. Jaxon watched from the porch, arms wrapped around Emma, his eyes wet. "You know," he whispered, "I spent years building companies that changed lives. But that little girl, she changed mine." Emma smiled. "And she did it without trying." If this story touched you, remember, miracles aren't just for headlines. They live in moments of kindness, in the courage to see others for who they are, but in the belief that love can reach where science cannot. Be someone's Layla, because you never know whose world you might unlock with nothing more than compassion and a handful of faith.